So what I want to do this time is talk about just a few issues. We're going to start by talking about cultural divergence. I want to raise the issue of hierarchy and its place in these complex societies, and then we're going to talk a bit about writing as well. So we actually, towards the beginning of the lecture, talked about this issue of the common ecology of the Great River Valleys. And obviously we have the rivers themselves as a common trait, but also just the climate, which is a fairly dry climate, semi-arid. We have easily workable soils in all these places. And what all that means is you have the possibility of irrigation, which is so vital for large-scale agriculture. So as we take that kind of broad view, if you remember on that first lecture, we did that thing where we kind of took the narrow view and then zoomed out. We're now in this broad view, and in the broad view, we find are these similar places. Dry climates or semi-dry, semi-arid climates with big rivers across these fairly large plains. However, this is also the era where we probably reach our greatest level of diversity. If you remember that idea of simple sameness to diversity to complex sameness, this is the era where there's the greatest differentiation. As civilizations, as these complex societies are first forming, they're becoming diverse. And so when we talk about this diversity, what we're really seeing is what we call cultural divergence. All right, so divergence is where things move in different directions. During the time of simple sameness, we have peoples spread fairly widely, but living very similar lives. We've reached a point now with the settling down of people, with people now living in particular environments, with particular challenges, that you see more and more of this cultural divergence. And so what we mean by that, essentially, and fairly simply, are differences in political structure, in religion, in trade, and the importance of trade, in writing, and in social structure. These divergences are emerging, as I said, because of the way these civilizations have to react to their distinct ecologies. Because it turns out that even amidst the similarities of their ecology in that broad sense, as we zoom in, we do start seeing there are some pretty significant differences. And so the big question for you guys for this week is, while I'm clearly saying here there are these divergences, there are these differences, I've also talked about the broad similarities. And so you have to now write about which of those is more significant to you. You know, do you choose to take that broad view and see them as basically variances on a similar type, right? Yeah, they're all river valleys. Yes, they do have differences, but it's more interesting to think about them as sharing things in common. Or do you take the different view, which is that the narrow perspective is probably more correct, and that yes, in this very, very, very broad sense, there are river valleys, they're semi-arid, they're easily workable soils, all that kind of stuff. But Egypt is just fundamentally different than China. And China is so different from the Indus Valley. So that's what you're going to be writing about. There's obviously no right answer to this. I go back and forth myself. I used to be much more of a believer in the idea that the similarities outweigh the differences. I have come around a little bit to the importance of those differences as well. But I would say I'm actually pretty much in the middle now. That there's important parts of seeing the similarities, but it is more important than I used to think to recognize those differences. So, you know, I will accept you taking a middle ground as I did. It's pretty weak, I will admit. Take a stand. I would ask you to do. And you know, I think one of the things we often do in academics is you don't always have to necessarily totally agree with what you're arguing. That when you get assignments like this, what the instructor is looking for is not that you have this deeply held view that you're willing to, you know, kind of die for, but that you can construct a solid argument, making use of the available information. So don't at all think that, you know, I'm going to hold you to this opinion or anything like that, or I'm going to judge you based on your opinion. What I'm really looking for is your ability to make a good argument using the information you've received from, you know, from this stuff, from the reading, from all the material we've kind of gone over. So then the question that kind of comes out of this is the relationship between the development of agriculture and the development of distinct culture. And culture we're defining now, and this definition is really significant. We're going to come back to it a little bit when we get to some other things. But culture being defined as socially transmitted behavior, beliefs, institutions, and technologies that a given group of people or peoples share. Culture, and as I said, we're going to come back to this, but culture is in many ways not distinct to humans, but humans use culture much more intensively than other species do. In terms of kind of biological evolution, we still are evolving, we're still changing, but one of the sources of human success is our adaptability, that we've been able to go into all these different environments, tackle all these different challenges, and thrive in many different environments. And one of the reasons for that is because of culture. Culture allows us to adapt very quickly to prevailing conditions without the necessity of waiting for evolution to take its course. All right? And so the kinds of behaviors that are passed down are often behaviors that increase the potential for survival. The beliefs we share are beliefs that help bind the group together and ensure success. The institutions, the technologies, all these things are essentially ways for us to help to survive in our given conditions. And so what culture does is establish these things, but culture is never set in stone. Things change, circumstances change, new challenges emerge, and culture has this ability to adapt to those changing conditions. So this helps answer this issue of why agriculture does lead to distinct cultures. Because as hunters and gatherers, although there are different environments, all that kind of stuff, largely speaking, the challenges are similar. Right? That you need to find food, you need to find animals that can be hunted, you need to find plants that can be gathered. And while there are certainly differences depending on environment, agricultural people must have, by necessity, a much more complex connection to the ecology around them, to the environment around them. And with that connection, there is a greater possibility for these very, very distinctive behaviors, beliefs, institutions, and technologies. So it's not to say that distinct cultures did not exist before agriculture, but that agriculture intensifies this process of distinctiveness by forcing people to live extremely closely with very, very particular environments, as opposed to shifting between environments, between ecologies, and then having these kind of broad adaptations that allow them to survive across a number of different environments. All right, now one big effect, and this is something that is not distinctive, it's not an example of divergence as much, is that as we move to complex societies, there is a steady downward trend in the status of women. All right, now this is something that does not happen as quickly everywhere, it does not happen as intensively everywhere, but virtually everywhere where we see the birth of agriculture and the establishment of complex societies, complex civilizations, we are seeing this trend towards lesser autonomy for women. In the time of the Ice Age, as art is first flowering, nearly all the depictions of humans were depictions of women. In the Tufian culture, as we talked about, there's not a lot of burials to suggest, status. But the one burial that really does suggest that most is a burial of a woman. There is every reason to assume and to believe that in the late forger societies, at the very least, women's social standing was equal, if not greater, than the social standing of men. Particularly, we can imagine, as gathering of these cereal grasses became more significant. Remember, it was the women who gathered the barley, who gathered the wheat. It was therefore the women who best understood those crops. Therefore, it was almost certainly the women who figured out how to plant the seeds on their own. It was the women who were making the selections. And it was only later on, as these now farmed plants became so significant to the diet, that the men returned from the hunt, as we can say, and began taking their place in agriculture. We actually see this in some societies in the Americas. There are some indigenous groups who, when Europeans arrive in the 15th, 16th century, let's say 16th, 17th century actually, in North America, these were societies that did engage in farming, but the men still hunted. And therefore, for a long time, agriculture was seen by these groups as women's work. As the United States kind of took hold and began exercising more authority over various indigenous groups in the East, one of the things they encouraged them to do was to settle down and farm. And one of the reasons that there was some resistance to this, and there are obviously many reasons, but one of the reasons there was some resistance is because of the idea that this was not the kind of work that men did. Men went out and they hunted, they roamed around, women did farming. And so in order to kind of convince these people to stop hunting and gathering, stop hunting at the very least, which from the American perspective took up too much space. The United States wanted their land after all. They had to encourage them to farm, which took up less space than hunting did. But again, the resistance was because they saw farming as women's work. And so we would assume something similar at the birth of farming, that women did this work. And therefore, for a time, their status would have been higher because of their control over so much of the calories. However, with the rise of complexity, we see several signs suggesting a decline in women's status and authority within societies. Now, why this is more mysterious than I think people sometimes think. There's this assumption that, of course, because men are stronger than women on average, that they would become the power holders in these societies. That does not really hold. After all, our leaders are not generally the strongest people in the society. There doesn't seem to be much of a link, after all, with strength and then those who rise to leadership. In fact, leadership is often more based on people who have good social relationships, people who can be charismatic, people who can be convincing, people who can get along with lots of different people. And there's no reason to think that those skills are particularly male skills. If anything, there's a lot of suggestion that women are actually better at those kind of things. So just looking at pure strength does not really work. Now, what people also will say sometimes is the rise of warfare is the big determinant here. And the reason for that is, again, they would say, well, men are just better suited for warfare. And as war becomes important, those who can go off to war and be successful and lead others into war are going to rise in status. And because men are the sex that is more prone to engage in those activities, they would have to ultimately be the leadership. But again, there's not much to suggest it's true. There is traditions around the world of female warriors. There is nothing to suggest that warfare was purely a physical act and that women would have been incapable of that kind of physical act. There's all kinds of examples historically of women engaging in tremendously difficult labor. I mean, literally labor, right, in terms of childbirth. But, as we saw in our film last time in New Guinea, as the men are off kind of playing around and shooting their bows off, the women are literally cutting down trees. They are processing those trees. It was tremendously physical labor. So the idea that women would not be capable of the kind of physical acts necessary for warfare just doesn't hold up historically. There's plenty of counterexamples. What makes more sense, and by the way, I'm not saying this is definitive. This is an issue that will always be debated. But as warfare becomes more significant in human societies, as agriculture develops and kind of complex society develops, it's men who tend to be the warriors, and not because necessarily of any physical traits, but simply for the fact that women are more important for the survival of a society than men. And that's for the obvious reason that women can bear children and men can't. A society can survive with few men and a relatively greater proportion of women, but it's not going to survive as well with few women and a relatively greater proportion of men. Right? You need those child bearers. In addition, the needs of child care at this time, and particularly nursing, kept women generally closer to home, something that is often more difficult when wars are involved. And so it's possible that men become warriors more so than women not because of these kind of physical traits, but more so because women could not be sacrificed in war. Women were too important for the overall survival of the society. Now, that decision, or the kind of decisions, or however that is, we kind of get to that, um, is happening at different times in different places. But what we see in virtually every place we've looked at least in this early phase of complex civilizations, is that the ruling class becomes a ruling class of either priests or warriors. Now, initially in many of these civilizations, women commonly were priestesses. They did have this role, this spiritual role. Women shaman were very, very prominent in an earlier period as well. But eventually, the warriors seem to kind of usurp the authority of the priests. And increasingly, we see the rise of these kind of warrior kings. And if status is going to come through warfare, as it seems to initially to eventually come, and women are more or less, although not everywhere, kind of removed from this this occupation essentially, then the ability of women to gain status would be limited. So again, I'm not positing that as the answer. I don't know if we'll ever have the answer, short of a time machine, and even that would be complex. But it's one way of explaining the rise of male power, the reduction of female status and power, and one that does not rely purely on this kind of physical argument. Because like I said, there is no real correlation between strength and then leadership historically. Often kings are not particularly physically powerful. All right. So again, this is an example of not cultural divergence, but an example where we can make generalizations. And the generalization ends up being that with the rise of complex society, there will be a diminution, there will be a lessening of the power and status of women within the society. And again, I'll repeat, it does not happen everywhere at the same rate. It doesn't happen everywhere with the same intensity. But there is that trend in all these societies. This image that's been on, by the way, is a little statuette from the Indus Valley. One of the few depictions, actually, we get of the human form from the Indus Valley civilization. It's a woman who is often going to be described as a dancer or prostitute. And so there is, even at that point, this this popularity of depicting the human form and using women to do so. That does become lessened over time, though, and we see fewer and fewer of this sort of thing in India, at least for a time. That does come back. All right, another example of the declining status of women, one of our clearest examples, comes from what's called an oracle bone transcription. This is from the Shang dynasty, China, so this would be about the 14th century BCE. And so the way the oracle bones worked is that what they would do is they basically ask a question. All right, so the point of the oracle bones was to essentially tell the future. So our first line here is the charge. You can read ahead if you want, but let's try to take this kind of bit by bit. So the charge is what they want to know. And what they want to know in this case is, would Lady Hao's childbearing be good? Lady Hao was the consort of the Shang king, one of his wives, in other words. Historical records suggest she was particularly important to him. She seemed to have a particularly high status amongst the wives of this king. And so he wants to know, will her childbearing be good? So the way this works is you would now have these specialized people who would take a metal rod, it would be bronze this time, and they would jam it into a bone. The bones were often the scapulas of cattle. They also used tortoise shells to do this. But they would shove this heated metal rod into the bone. It would create cracks. And the way they would tell the future is by essentially reading those cracks. All right, so we see similar practices in different places. In Mesopotamia, the practice was they sliced open the bellies of sheep and then let the entrails fall out, and then a specialized priest would essentially read the entrails. The way they fell would offer signs. So it's all fairly random and strange. The Chinese do it this way. It's a little less messy than cutting open a sheep, I would guess. So there seems to be a transition at some point where there used to be a specialized priest or shaman figure who was responsible for reading the cracks. But what this particular transcription shows is that it was the king who read the cracks. All right, so he has kind of taken over this role of shaman, of one who can kind of contact the spirit world. And he says that the cracks suggest if it be a ding day childbearing, it will be good. If it be a gang day childbearing, there will be prolonged luck. This suggests there's a calendar, by the way, that they have reference to, and that essentially if it's the child's born on this kind of day, it'll be this outcome. If it's born on this kind of day, it'll be that outcome. The phrase prolonged luck is not very descriptive, but anyway, we can move on. The last step then, or technically I guess the second to last step, was the actual verification. So what actually happened? In this case, we get this very famous line, because this is quoted frequently actually. After 31 days on Jiayin, so this is one of these days, she gave birth. It was not good. It was a girl. All right. So this ends up being this very clear statement of declining status. All right. That women were already devalued at this time to the extent that the childbirth was considered not good because she had given birth to a girl. This suggests what we call a patrilineal society, a society in which inheritance goes to the male side, in which the male line is more important than the female line. It suggests patriarchy, a society dominated by men as well. And this is certainly going to be a trend in China, really from this point forward. We will see it in other societies certainly as well, but this is an indication of where we have arrived in Chinese history. The last step, by the way, of this process is they would inscribe these results into the bone itself. And so that's where we get our first Chinese writing. We will talk about that more in a bit. All right, so there is cultural differentiation for sure. The actual roles of women, the actual status of women is different in these different places. But as I said earlier, there is a general trend across these complex societies away from female autonomy and female political power. And by the way, this is an example of an oracle bone, just as an illustration. You can see the cracks here, and that's essentially what they're reading, and then this is the transcription. This writing here is a transcription of what happened. All right, so actually jumping off from this issue of male and female power is this broader issue of hierarchy. All right, so this is another example actually where we see have some generalizations we can make. And the big generalization is that hierarchy comes into existence across all these civilizations. The question then becomes, is this necessary? All right, do complex societies require hierarchy, or do they merely encourage hierarchy? Now, we don't have a good answer for this. This is not something we can fully answer. What we can say is that hierarchy has developed in all these complex societies. We don't really have an example of a complex society absent hierarchy. As I just said, do complex societies require it or just encourage it? Now, one way to look at hierarchy, and I think an interesting way to look at it, comes from this scholar named Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote this book called Sapien. I've actually quoted it a few times already in the first few classes. I will do it one more time. I think it will be the last time I'll use it this semester, a little bit later on in this particular talk. So what Harari says is not necessarily an answer to this question, but information that kind of helps us understand why hierarchy is important in complex societies. He says hierarchies serve an important function. They enable complete strangers to know how to treat one another without wasting the time and energy needed to become personally acquainted. One of the real big changes that's coming from the emergence of these larger and larger and more complex societies is how much more often strangers are going to encounter each other. We talked about the kind of imagined realities, what we'll also call the imagined order, right, and why that's important for social cohesion. It allows strangers to have things in common as long as they believe in the same imagined reality or imagined order. Hierarchy kind of serves a similar purpose in that in particular societies, hierarchy will be marked in various ways. But usually, almost always, hierarchy will be visually recognizable, meaning that you can encounter somebody on the street, somebody you've never met before, And you will be able to identify their place in the hierarchy based on the way they dress, based on the way they wear their hair, based on these various physically visible characteristics. And this is crucial because in a world in which strangers are constantly encountering each other, it would be very wasteful in terms of time and energy if you always needed to kind of figure out who everybody was individually before knowing the way to treat them. All right. So hierarchy kind of simplifies that. Hierarchy creates these clear gradations. Hierarchy establishes various roles for people. And hierarchy allows us to know things about others without this necessity of personal acquaintance, of small talk, basically, right? And so that's an interesting way of looking at this. Again, we can't fundamentally say whether hierarchy is necessary or just encouraged, but it's certainly present in all these societies. And Harari's explanation for this does make some sense. It fits again into this idea of just having an order that we all understand. And as long as we understand that order, it will reduce the frequency of hostility. It does not get rid of that possibility, but it reduces it. A bunch of strangers living together who know nothing about the other, who have no shared ideas of who they are, what they represent. That's a very dangerous situation. All right, so let's talk further about hierarchies in the River Valley civilizations. This now will get us further into the kind of differentiation, the differences we see. All right, so in Egypt, we get the pharaoh, and I know I talked about the pharaoh a little bit already, but the pharaoh is kind of a distinctive figure in that his role is much more pronounced than what we see in the other River Valley civilizations. The pharaoh is not just a king, not just a ruler. He is a living god. Now, we will see in all these places, with the exception of the Indus Valley, where we just don't have the information, that kings, that rulers, do have some kind of spiritual role. But what that often means is they have some kind of connection to the spirits. Whereas in Egypt, we see something a little more intensive, and that is the king, the pharaoh, is literally a god himself. All right. For this reason, or at least partially for this reason, we see no written laws in Egypt. Essentially, the word of the pharaoh is law. You don't need anything more than that. Now, ecology plays a role here, it turns out, because of the stability of the Egyptian environment. What it ultimately means is that things are predictable, right? That the river will do the things the river does. It will mostly provide the water you need. It will mostly provide the silt you need to continue farming. It will mostly flood when it's supposed to flood and not flood when it's not supposed to flood. And that predictability allows Egyptian rulers to take on more responsibilities, to claim, I should say, greater status. All right, so if you're the king in a place where rivers are more volatile, where the environment is more unpredictable, it would be hard to say, I am a god myself, because if you're a god, then why does all this bad stuff keep happening? All right, if you could control this, then why don't you? In Egypt, though, again, that's a little bit easier to make those claims, because if you say the river is going to flood at this time of year, it's going to gently deposit silt across our landscape and allow for bountiful farming for another year, well, you're mostly going to be right. You're going to be right enough, at least, that that you're not going to be undermined in terms of your authority. So Cheops here, Khufu, as he's also called, is the guy who is interred in the Great Pyramid, the most famous pyramid, one of the great pharaohs of Egypt, and a guy who certainly claims this dramatic authority. In Mesopotamia, the situation is very different. The Mesopotamian environment, as we talked about in class, is incredibly volatile. All right? It is hard to predict. The rivers are just flooding willy-nilly. I don't know if I've ever said willy-nilly before, but that's how volatile they are. I have to say willy-nilly. The environment will throw out these massive, unpredictable storms. Sandstorms will kind of rise up and just sweep away landscapes, sweep away farming, bury cities. And so in that case, the king's authority is much more difficult to manage. They can't claim that they can tell the future. They can't claim that they have these expanded authorities, because they're going to get seen through pretty quickly if they claim that. And so in this case, then, it becomes more necessary for kings to kind of make their case, right? And so what we see here is essentially a piece of propaganda. This is a king of in Mesopotamia, and this is all about his greatness, right? Now, the historical records suggest that he's actually not very successful, that his line would essentially end with him, but he's making the case here for his contribution to the bounteousness of his people. He's holding in his hand this oil flask, and it's overflowing with kind of these riches. And then the text also speaks to all the good he had done. But as you read, if you read the text, translate at least, what you end up with is almost desperate attempt to say, no, 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 you got to believe me. I'm important. I did good things. Don't believe the lies. Fake news, I think is what he's saying, actually. So there's this kind of instability built into Mesopotamian ecology, and that means kings have to be more careful with what they claim. Mesopotamian kings do have a religious role, at times, in kind of communicating with gods, in terms of, I should say, reading various signs, but they cannot claim the authority of being a god themselves. This hilarious image is again from Mesopotamia, and this depicts Gilgamesh. And I think this one is a real kind of cautionary tale in some ways. What is being depicted here is Gilgamesh, and this might very well be the famed Gilgamesh of kind of ancient literature. What he's doing is wrestling this bull, and the bull is the kind of representation of drought. Right? So what the image then suggests is that the powers of Gilgamesh are such that drought cannot stand up to his authority. So when I said this was a cautionary tale, what I mean by that is, not knowing the time, I'm going to assume that you can't actually wrestle a bull to keep drought from occurring. And people who claim they can wrestle drought to the ground like this are claiming authority they cannot actually control. They can't actually maintain. And so where there are rulers who are claiming abilities that are beyond their actual capacity, are going to be in a difficult situation. They're going to put themselves in difficult situations because drought is going to come. In Mesopotamia, it's going to happen relatively frequently. And any claims that you can keep it from happening are always going to be problematic. All right, so let's talk about written language now. And just on the issue of hierarchy, as I said, we don't really have a good sense of what was going on in the Indus Valley. There is some reason to suspect, at least, that the Indus Valley civilization was not quite as hierarchical as the others, that it was a bit more egalitarian than the others, but there is still some suggestion of an elite class of people. If not a single individual dominating the society, at least an elite class of people who lived more comfortable lives than the rest. All right, so let's talk about written language. I think we will stop here. I think this will get us through enough of what we need to get through. But this gets us back to this issue of kind of culture and adaptability. All right, that we have this uniqueness amongst species in that our DNA is not everything about us. Right? That our behavior is not just about these kind of inherent traits. It's about these kind of cultural and socially constructed ideas. So we're not all innate. We're not all about instinct. A lot of what we do is because of socially constructed, culturally constructed ideas of what is proper, what is improper, and that sort of thing. Humans are a particularly social animal. I did not get into this the previous week, but it's an important idea. We are an incredibly social animal, and we live in these very complex societies. Even before we get to agriculture, our societies are complex. And so this leads to potential problems. All right. However, the way these issues are dealt with a little bit is actually through biology, and that is humans have very long childhoods. All right. We develop quickly, or I'm sorry, we're born relatively early. Our brains are so big, our heads are so big, that if we had fully developed in the womb, women would not be able to give birth to us. Right? Mothers would not be able to give birth. Our birth canals are too narrow for our heads. So humans are born before they're fully developed. Our heads are still soft. They're not as big as they would become. And this allows us to be born through what are relatively narrow birth canals. Being born early then has a couple effects. It means on the one hand that we're helpless. Right? Babies are completely helpless. They can do nothing. Right? They barely can open their eyes. You watch a horse being born, they can kind of stand up right away. Right? We're pretty close to it. Humans can't do that. Being born so early, though, while it does make us helpless, gives us extra time to learn all the social behaviors necessary to survive in our societies. Right? So we have this elongated childhood. We have this elongated period of just complete helplessness as well. And that ends up playing a really, really big role in that it allows us to pick up on social and cultural norms. So that once we come of age a little bit, once we reach at least later childhood, when we can walk and talk and do all the things that we kind of need to, we have already kind of ingested, already learned a bunch of these behaviors that are not encoded in our DNA. All right, so this, again, on that same point, the rules of social order are not passed down hereditarily. They don't just emerge from birth. They have to be taught, and that long childhood allows that to happen. So, because our societies get larger and larger, the imagined order that's created, those imagined realities that we invent, require a conscious effort. We can't just say, well, it'll all work out. There's this constant effort needed to hold everything together, to maintain the order that we've constructed. Now, humans can memorize a lot of information. Our brains are massive, of course. But as we get to the time of the large complex states, the amount of information, the pure quantity of information, becomes too large. All right? There, are generally going to be in most groups, small groups or large groups for that matter, some individual or individuals who are essentially specialized memory experts. They can memorize the stories. They can pass down those stories, right? Those are the bards, right? Those are the storytellers. Sometimes those are the priests or the shamans who have that role as well. So it's always going to be the case in human groups that somebody has that role. But as societies get larger and larger and more complex, the idea that one person can do this, or any individuals can memorize all the information that goes into these massive states, becomes less likely. Because ultimately the human brain is a poor storage unit for the immense amounts of data that these big societies are creating. Again, it's fine when you have a small society. It's fine when all the information can be told in stories or turned into songs or chants, which are easy to memorize. It gets a little more difficult when you get to these very, very large societies. So there's basically three reasons why our brains don't make for the best storage units when it comes to massive amounts of information. On the one hand, our brain capacity is limited. You guys are probably encountering this. You're like, why is he still talking? My brain cannot store any more of this information. But we've all had that thing in the modern world where you have some bit of information in your brain that's ridiculous and unnecessary, but it's just in there, and we have that feeling. What if I could get rid of that stupid song's lyrics, for instance, and have some important information in there instead? But there's that kind of idea. No, that's taking up space in our brain. There's no room for understanding the tax code or whatever it is. All right. So we have limited brain capacities. We just cannot store everything. Second, obviously, I hope I'm not shocking you guys here. I hope nobody spirals into kind of this existential crisis because of this. But we are mortal. We are all going to die, and so even if certain individuals could memorize huge amounts of information, the tendency is not the tendency, they are going to take it with them when they die. All that work to memorize and store is lost upon death, and you can do your best to make sure there's somebody there who's at your your beck and call and who's learning from you. But one of the things about death, and even more so in ancient societies than our own, is that it is unpredictable. We just don't know when our time is going to come. And so the idea that you can be prepared for your death is never totally going to be true. Maybe you don't have time to pass on all your information before you die. Maybe your mentor died early, and so you didn't get all of his information. And then maybe you die early, and so whoever you're mentoring, whoever your, we'll call him an intern is, doesn't memorize all the stuff that you had memorized. It's very easy to lose information when it's all stored in these brains of mortal creatures. But the last issue gets more into the specific components of complex societies. That, as I was suggesting earlier, our brain is pretty good at storing and processing certain types of information, especially when they're stories. One of the reasons that stories are significant, so significant to humans, is they're just good ways of memorizing things, right? There's a chronology, there's a beginning, middle, and end. There's often a moral. There's familiar characters. And so if you have all those components, you can remember a story. And even if the story, changed a little bit. Remember with the story of Mushi, the kind of Moses story told by that Chinese historian. The story kind of survived as it moved from place to place. It wasn't exactly the same, but many of the same elements were there. So as long as you have kind of the right characters, kind of the right chronology, and hopefully the right moral as well, you don't need to memorize every detail. Songs also. One of the reasons that songs are so important is that they're mnemonic devices. They're devices that help us memorize things. What we're not really good at, apparently, though, is dealing with large amounts of mathematical data. And this is what complex societies are generating to huge degrees. This is data about calendars, about the cycle of the year. This is tax data. This is population data. And this just doesn't store very well. And so it seems as if, as this happens, it becomes more and more necessary for these societies to develop some kind of system by which they can record this mathematical data. And that's where we get written languages. Written languages are not universal in complex societies. The Inca Empire is our most famous example of an empire that did not have a writing system, but they did have actually a system of recording information. They did so through this knot system. They would take ropes and they tied knots in them, and that would kind of you could read those. So it's not technically a written language, but it is an information storage device. So from essentially the third millennium, we get our first writing systems. This is going to be in Mesopotamia. It's a system called cuneiform, and what they would do is they create these clay tablets, and they would make these marks in the clay. The first writing in virtually every society, or at least most frequently, the first writing is not going to be stories. It's not going to be, those kind of fun things. It's going to be kind of dry data, because this is the information that was harder to keep. And so in Mesopotamia, the earliest records are, records of sheep and taxation and stuff like that. And only later on do we start seeing the stories. Gilgamesh, obviously being the most famous. But there is a sense that those kind of stories are in some ways too important to write down. That in the case of those stories, you want somebody who's specialized at kind of remembering, and then telling those stories. And that will continue on, for thousands of years. The Iliad, the famous Greek story of this war between Troy and Greece. That story was much older as kind of oral literature. It was a story that was told. It was not written by Homer. It was a story that was told by Homer, and then only much, much later was it written down. We see this over and over again, that the kind of really important stories are oral before they become written down. And that's often much, much later on, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. The earliest writing systems are almost all what we would call logograms. All right, and so we see this in Egypt with the hieroglyphs, Mesopotamia with the cuneiform, and with the Chinese logograms. Now, what logograms essentially are these characters. All right, they are sometimes based on the thing they're representing. You can see the way that in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the the glyph for rain kind of looks like rain falling from the sky. That sun is round, right? That a beer jug kind of looks like a beer jug. That a cobra kind of looks like a cobra. And so hieroglyphs are a little bit pictographic in that sense. They do rely on a little bit on what the thing looks like, but not entirely actually. You see in Chinese, similarly, there is some connection between the thing being represented and then the symbol as well. And then also you see that in cuneiform. But what logograms really are is not necessarily pictographs where the thing is represented by the way it's depicted in the symbol. That the way logograms work is that each symbol contains meaning. All right. And this is true of all three of these early written languages. This is different from alphabetic languages, like we have now, in which the symbols represent sounds. So in these kind of languages, literacy required massive amounts of memorization. You had to memorize, in Chinese, I don't have the data for the other two, in Chinese, you have to memorize at least, I think, 2,000 characters to be literate, and then highly educated people would know thousands more. So there are benefits and kind of detriments to this kind of system, but the first writing systems are all logographic, and it's not going to be until the Phoenicians, much later on in the first millennium, that we get an alphabetic script, and then ultimately that alphabetic script would spread elsewhere. All right, so you're gonna read, one of your things you're reading is the importance of writing and civilization, so you can kind of continue that discussion there. Lastly, I'm not going to read through all this, but please examine this slide here. The PowerPoint again is posted on the module or in the module, or you can just pause this and read it certainly as well. But it's just kind of differentiating the cultures of these four River Valley civilizations. And then based on what you know about the ecology, you can maybe make this connection between why in China kings have these particular powers, why various elements of their society would result from their particular ecologies. All right, I'm going to finish there. That went a little bit longer than I had intended, but once I get going, you can't stop me. So I apologize for that. So we'll see what happens in the weeks to come. Every once in a while, I'll probably do these. It's not my preferred way of doing it. I'd rather take care of this in class and then do other things. But there were just these particular issues